Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and today we are going to explore one of the most ancient, most powerful, and honestly, probably one of the most misunderstood symbols in human consciousness, and that's the serpent, the snake, the dragon, I guess. Not really in the medieval sense, but historically. So honestly, from the moment our ancestors first encountered these limbless hunters coiled in the grass, snakes have occupied a unique place in human imagination. They appear in creation myths and obviously religious texts, alchemical manuscripts, and modern occult practices. They represent everything from divine wisdom to diabolic temptation, from healing medicine to deadly venom, and honestly, from spiritual transformation to primal cunning. But here's what really strikes me the most about serpent symbolism, and it just refuses to be simple. Unlike any other animal symbol that might represent one primary quality, like the loyalty of dogs or the courage of lions and, owls and their wisdom, serpents simply embody paradox, and they are simultaneously creative and destructive, wise and dangerous, and, healing and poisonous, earthly and transcendent. And this paradoxical nature isn't a bug in a serpent symbolism, it's the feature. Because snakes represent something fundamental about the nature of power itself, and the real power is never simple. It's never purely beneficial or purely harmful. It exists in the spaces between categories, which we love here, all the liminal spaces, in these liminal realms where transformation becomes possible. And when we really think about it, the same venom that can kill you in minutes also forms the basis for life-saving medications. The same serpent that sheds its skin in perfect renewal is also the apex predator that can swallow prey twice its diameter. And the same energy that awakens the Kundalini, which we will talk about, can also burn out unprepared nervous systems. So, this is why I think, so many cultures have been both revered and feared of the whole serpent energy and physically in general. They represent forces that don't fit neatly into our human categories of good and evil, safe and dangerous, beneficial and harmful. Whether Christianity has tried to do that or not, they exist in that uncomfortable space where wisdom and power intersect with risk and transformation. So today I want to explore the full spectrum of serpent wisdom for you guys. And, it appears in magical traditions around the world. I am definitely going to talk about lots of different cultures here, just briefly, but this is honestly just going to give us a better understanding of serpent energy as a whole and how important it's really been for thousands of years. It's been preserved and distorted throughout history. Modern practitioners can work with serpent consciousness in their own practice, which we'll also talk about. And I want to dive into the symbol of the serpent as transformation and rebirth, as a keeper of ancient wisdom and even forbidden knowledge, as the embodiment of Kundalini, and as the teacher of kind of a strategic intelligence that our culture often mislabels as cunning or deception. I definitely want to be clear from the start. We're not talking about cartoon villains or biblical metaphors. We're talking about one of the most sophisticated and nuanced symbol systems in human consciousness. Working with the serpent energy requires spiritual maturity, some sort of psychological preparation, honestly, and the kind of moral complexity that makes some people uncomfortable. But, serpents teach hard truths. They teach that growth requires shedding old skins, that wisdom often comes through painful experiences, and that protection sometimes requires the capacity for harm. The real transformation involves dying to who you were and being reborn as who you are becoming. Okay, so let's start at the beginning to truly understand the significance of serpent symbolism, or at least close to the beginning, as archaeological evidence can really take us. And what we find is remarkable. Serpent worship and serpent symbolism appear independently in virtually every ancient civilization that we know of. This isn't cultural diffusion. This isn't one culture borrowing symbolism and just symbols from another. This is something much more profound. The independent recognition across human cultures that serpents represent something fundamental about nature of consciousness, power, and transformation. Think about what this means from the frozen tundra of, ancient Siberia to the tropical rainforests of Mesoamerica and Egypt and the river valleys of India. Human beings independently developed complex spiritual systems centered around serpent imagery. And this wasn't accidental, this wasn't a coincidence, it was absolutely recognition. In ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest record of these serpents within civilization already appear as symbols of divine wisdom and otherworldly knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest literary works, features a serpent that steals the herb of immortality. But notice the complexity here. The serpent isn't a simple villain. It's a keeper of secrets about death and renewal that humans aren't quite yet ready to process. And in this story, it contains everything we need to understand about the serpent consciousness. The serpent doesn't prevent humans from achieving immortality out of malice. It takes the herb because humans, in their current state of development, aren't prepared for that level of power and responsibility. And the serpent is both obstacle and teacher, both guardian and guide. In ancient Egyptian civilization, this provides perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of the serpent or the snake symbolism that we have. The uraeus, the cobra symbol worn on pharaohs' crowns, represented not just royal power, but the activated divine consciousness that made pharaonic authority really possible. But really, what most people don't understand about the uraeus is it wasn't just a decorative symbol. Egyptian magical texts describe it as a living force that could literally destroy the pharaoh's enemies through spiritual fire. And this was awakened, or this kind of awakened Kundalini energy made manifest in the world. The serpent power that flows through an enlightened ruler and protects the cosmic order they represent. But Egypt also understood the power of this duality within the serpent. Apep, the serpent of chaos, represented the destructive forces that constantly threatened cosmic order. And every night, as Ra traveled through the underworld, he had to battle Apep to ensure that the sun would rise again. Yet, even Apep wasn't purely evil. It was understood as a necessary force that created the dynamic tension required for existence itself. Without Apep, without the constant challenge of this chaos, the cosmos would become static and lifeless. The Egyptians understood that creation requires both order and chaos, both construction and destruction, both the Uraeus of divine kingship and the Apep of primordial challenge. So, also, the Egyptian medical tradition recognized serpents as symbols of healing, which obviously we see even today. The rod of Asclepius, which we still use today as the medical symbol, comes from this ancient understanding that serpent energy could both poison and cure, both kill and heal, which obviously is very akin to the whole if a witch can heal, they can also curse. The same force that brings death also brings this renewal, and the same venom that destroys diseased tissue also stimulates the body's healing response. So, ancient Greek culture inherited and expanded these serpent traditions. The Oracle at Delphi, the most important prophetic site in the ancient world, was originally sacred to Python, a massive serpent that represented the chthonic wisdom of the earth itself. When Apollo took over the site, he had to slay Python. But even then, the serpent's wisdom remained integral to the oracle's power. So this story represents the tension between, this masculine, solar, rational consciousness and the lunar, feminine, more intuitive consciousness. Apollo represents the clear, bright wisdom of intellectual understanding, while Python represents the deep, dark wisdom that emerges from the earth itself, from the unconscious depths of the psyche. And the genius of the Delphic oracle was that it combined both forms of consciousness. The Pythia, the priestess who delivered the prophecies, channeled both Apollonian clarity and Pythonic depth. She could access the serpent wisdom of the earth while maintaining enough solar consciousness to communicate what she received. Greek mystery traditions used serpent symbolism extensively in their initiation rituals. The Dionysic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, and other secret cults all incorporated serpents as symbols of death and rebirth, and the shedding of old consciousness in the emergence of new spiritual awareness. Initiates would literally handle live serpents as part of their training, learning to work with dangerous forces without fear or hatred. And this wasn't just symbolic work, it was practical training in the kind of consciousness required for advanced spiritual practice. You cannot work with real power if you're afraid of real danger. Hindu tradition offers perhaps the most complete, sophisticated understanding of serpent energy in spiritual practice because, the Kundalini, maybe you've heard of it. It's kind of a huge thing. Literally meaning coiled serpent represents the dormant spiritual energy that lies at the base of the spine, waiting to be awakened. I do have a tiny bit of experience, I would say, in the Kundalini. I was kind of deep dived into this practice a little bit. But Hindu tradition also recognizes that Kundalini energy is not something to be approached lightly. And the classical texts are filled with warnings about premature or improper Kundalini awakening. When awakened prematurely or improperly, it can cause severe physical and psychological disruption. It requires years of preparation, proper guidance, and moral development before it can be safely worked with. The Naga tradition in Hinduism and Buddhism recognizes serpents as a distinct class of spiritual beings, neither human nor divine, but something in between. Nagas are understood to possess great wisdom and magical power, but they're also dangerous and unpredictable. They must be approached with respect and proper protocol. The stories of Nagas teach us about the relationship between humans and non-human intelligence. Nagas aren't evil, but they operate according to different values and priorities than humans. They can be powerful allies if approached correctly, but they can also be quite dangerous enemies if disrespected or misunderstood. And so there is also some snaky stuff in Celtic traditions, which I don't think we hear too much of, but in these traditions, it was understood that serpents as symbolisms of the land's vital energy. Ley lines, they were sometimes called serpent paths, and the movement of earth energy was visualized as serpentine. The Druids wore serpent eggs as symbols of their connection to this telluric power. Even in the relatively cold climate of the Celtic lands, where actual serpents were less common, the serpent remained a powerful spiritual symbol. And this suggests that, snake consciousness transcends the physical presence of actual snakes. It represents something archetypal, something fundamental to the structure of the consciousness itself. And finally, in pre Columbian American civilizations, serpents appeared as fundamental tools of divine power. Quetzalcoatl, the feared serpent, represented the union of earth and sky, matter and spirit, the heavy wisdom of the serpent, and the soaring inspiration of the bird. It is the classic snake with the wings. And the Hopi snake dances were elaborate rituals designed to maintain harmony between human communities and the serpent spirits that controlled rain and fertility. These weren't symbolic ceremonies, they actually involved handling live rattlesnakes in elaborate community rituals that could last for days. So, really, what can strike you about all these traditions is that their sophistication in understanding serpent energy. None of them treat serpents as symbols of evil or good. Instead, they recognize that serpents are these representatives of fundamental life forces that are simultaneously creative and destructive, wise and dangerous, and necessary and unpredictable. So, this ancient wisdom stands in stark contrast to the simplified symbolism that we often encounter in modern culture, where serpents have been reduced to symbols of temptation, evil, or at best, medical healing. The full spectrum of serpent wisdom has been largely lost in contemporary consciousness. But for those willing to look beyond the surface, interpretations And honestly, you engage with the deeper mysteries that serpents represent. The ancient wisdom remains accessible. It requires approaching serpents not as symbols to be interpreted, but as forces to be experienced. Not as metaphors to be understood, but as these energies that are truly to be worked with. And honestly, I know everyone has their own way of seeing and interpreting energy, and what energy manipulation looks like for each witch is different. Uh, to get a little personal for me, I have always been very close to serpents, and I look at energy and energy manipulation as serpents and snakes. So for me, every rock, every mineral, every plant, every spirit, not every spirit, but I should say these energies come to me as serpents, and I can see them. They all look different, and whether I can coax them out or they approach me. Either way, this serpent energy has been very large for me in my practice. Um, and it's honestly one of the most powerful and universally recognized aspects of serpent symbolism is this energy and this connection to transformation, to the death and the rebirth. So, as we understand to approach serpent energy with the proper respect and the adequate preparation and the willingness to be fundamentally transformed by the encounter, this isn't about intellectual understanding. It's about direct spiritual experience of forces that really shaped human consciousness since our earliest beginnings. So, with that said, let's get into the rebirth and the whole shedding of skins and the transformation when it comes to snakes, because this is huge. It's not just metaphorical, it's based on direct observation of, the actual serpent behavior that our ancestors understood, which contained profound spiritual teachings. When a snake sheds its skin, it doesn't just grow a new outer layer. The entire process is a kind of ritual death and resurrection. For days before the shed, the snake becomes sluggish, its eyes cloud over, its colors fade. Honestly, if you own a snake or if you've witnessed this particular thing, it is kind of magical. I had a snake for quite a while. Her name was Satine, and I don't know, there's something just always a little magical about this stage. And so it enters this liminal state between life and death, between its old form and its new one. During this pre-shed phase, the snake becomes very vulnerable, sometimes even a little irritable. Its vision is impaired, its movements are restricted, it often stops eating entirely, and in the wild, this is a very dangerous time when the snake is more susceptible to predators and environmental threats. Yet the snake cannot avoid this phase. It's an essential part of its growth cycle. Then comes the actual shedding, a struggle to emerge from the old skin that can take hours and requires the snake to rub against rough surfaces, to push and strain and work itself free from really what it has outgrown. And the snake must literally crawl out of its old self, leaving behind a perfect replica of what it used to be. Finally, it emerges renewed. Its colors are bright and its skin is gleaming. The scales are gorgeous and soft, literally reborn into a larger version of itself. But this isn't just physical growth. The entire nervous system has been renewed. The snake is quite literally a new creature. Though it carries the memories and the instincts of its previous form, this process contains everything we need to know about spiritual transformation. Real growth requires periods of withdrawal and introspection. It involves discomfort, struggle, and the willingness to let go of what we've outgrown, even when letting go is difficult or painful. And it results in genuine renewal, not just cosmic or cosmetic change, but fundamental expansion of our capacity and awareness. I've honestly found that working with serpent energy during periods of major life transitions can be extraordinarily powerful. And most times I find they actually come to me first during these periods of my life, which kind of gives me a heads up that I know it is about to go down. And the serpent teaches us how to navigate the liminal spaces between who we were and who we are becoming, how to be patient and with the process of transformation, how to struggle when struggle is honestly necessary, and surrender when surrender serves us better. But serpent transformation isn't gentle or comfortable. It's not the kind of gradual change that our culture often prefers. It's dramatic, it's complete, it's irreversible, and it honestly kind of fucking sucks sometimes. So when a snake sheds its skin, it can't put the old one back on. There's no going back to who it was before, just like us. Even if we try, it never works. This is why serpent energy can be intimidating for some people who prefer incremental change or who want to maintain control over their transformation process. The serpent consciousness demands complete commitment. It's this trust to the process of becoming. It asks us to have faith that, what emerges from our struggles will be worth the difficulty of the journey. And in my own practice, like I've said, I've learned to recognize the signs that a serpent shedding process is beginning in my life, whether they come to me in dreams, in real life, symbols, just they honestly snake their way in no matter what, no matter what or how. There's a restlessness, a sense that my current ways of being no longer fit. And my spiritual practice feels maybe a little stale during this time, almost like that symbolic hardening up and dulling thing that happens with their skin and their eye caps when they're about to shed. And sometimes relationships can even feel strained. You know, Sometimes work feels too small for who I'm becoming. And these are the times when I call on the serpent energy to guide me through the transformation process. And you can create rituals around the intention of shedding old patterns, beliefs, and ways of being that no longer serve you. I work with meditation and trance work all the time in my practice, and this really, really helps me navigate the discomfort of being between skins. So, the serpent also teaches us about the relationship between death and rebirth in spiritual practice. In many traditions, like we've said before, spiritual advancement requires a series of symbolic deaths: the death of the ego, the death of old identities, the death of limiting beliefs and patterns. But our culture has become so afraid of death that many people resist these necessary spiritual deaths. Even like shit, what you believe in. Most people are afraid to admit or confront the fact that they maybe don't believe in something that they once did before. And they kind of want to seem like I've always been this way or I've always thought this, blah, 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 blah. We have to really dive into what it means to always be changing. This transformation without loss, growth without grief, rebirth without having to die to their old selves. They want to add new capabilities and awareness without releasing old patterns and limitations. And serpent energy doesn't allow this kind of spiritual bypassing. It insists that real transformation requires a real death. Okay, maybe not like a physical death, but the genuine ending of old ways of being. And it teaches us that this death is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as the necessary precursor to rebirth. So maybe you find yourself wanting or trying to change without letting anything die. Maybe you want to become a new person while holding on to your old patterns. And whether you realize this or not, you are kind of seeking the spiritual growth, but without emotional disruption. That just can't happen. The result is spiritual constipation, this energy kind of backing up because there's no room for new growth. So, working with this energy of the serpent can really help you understand that transformation is not addition, it's metamorphosis. The caterpillar doesn't become the butterfly by adding wings to its existing form. It will literally dissolve into a primordial soup and reconstitute itself as something completely different. This disillusion phase is what a lot of people call the dark night of the soul. And it's really like this period when old structures of meaning and identity just break down, but your new ones haven't yet emerged. And it's a time of confusion, disorientation, and often deep grief for maybe who we used to be. But serpent wisdom teaches us that this disillusion phase is not a sign that something's wrong, it's a sign that transformation is working. Just as the snake becomes sluggish and cloudy eyed before it's shed, we often feel very confused and directionless before major spiritual breakthroughs. The key is learning to trust the process even when we can't see where it's leading. to allow the disillusion without panicking, to resist this temptation to grasp onto old identities and patterns simply because they're familiar. I remember going through a particularly intense serpent shedding period in my life, even though I knew, or I thought I knew about myself and my purpose just really at that time seemed to crumble. Lots of day-to-day things didn't feel the same anymore, and even my spiritual practices seemed empty and mechanical. For months, it felt like I was living in a fog, couldn't make decisions, and I couldn't see clearly what I wanted or where I was going. And everything just feels uncertain and unstable. My first impulse was to kind of fight this state naturally, to try to force this clarity and direction back into my life. But working with the separate energy taught me to surrender to this disillusion. So then I began to trust that something new was preparing to emerge, even though I couldn't see what it was yet. To honor that kind of cloudy eyed phase is an essential part of the process. When new skin finally emerges, when the shedding is complete, I found that I had become someone fundamentally different, not just improved or enhanced, but literally a new person with new priorities, new capabilities, and completely different relationship to life and power. Serpent energy also teaches us that the cyclical nature of transformation. Snakes don't shed once and then stop growing. They go through multiple shedding cycles throughout their lives, and each one allowing for further growth and development. Similarly, spiritual transformation isn't a one time event. You don't have one spiritual awakening. It happens a lot. It's an ongoing process of death and rebirth, shedding and renewal. Each cycle takes us deeper into our authentic nature, strips away more of what's false and limiting, and allows for greater expression of our true spiritual potential. So, really understanding this cyclical nature helps us to develop patience with our own transformation process. And a lot of people do not have patience, and I've been there. It's, this instant gratification society. You just got to bow down to it sometimes and just go with the flow. But perhaps most importantly, serpent energy teaches us that this transformation was not even optional to begin with, especially for those on spiritual paths. Growth is the natural state of consciousness. When we resist necessary changes, we cling to outgrown patterns and identities, we create spiritual stagnation that eventually becomes toxic. And the serpent reminds us that we must keep growing, keep shedding, keep dying, and keep being reborn if we want to remain spiritually alive. This isn't about constant upheaval or endless change for its own sake, but it's about staying responsive to the natural rhythms of growth and development that govern all living systems. So, when you work with this serpent consciousness, you learn to welcome the transformation cycles rather than resist them. You develop the courage to let go when letting go is necessary and find the patience to endure the uncomfortable in between phases. You cultivate the trust needed to believe that what emerges from our struggles will be worth the difficulty of the journey. And the serpent doesn't promise that transformation will be easy either, but it does promise that it will be authentic, complete, and ultimately liberating. When you shed your old skin, you don't just get a fresh coat of paint, you get fundamentally renewed existence. So, I want to roll back to the forbidden knowledge and ancient wisdom of this beautiful, beautiful, snaky creature. Perhaps no aspect of serpent symbolism has been more misunderstood in our culture than its association with forbidden knowledge and hidden wisdom. Thanks largely to the Christian interpretation of the Genesis story. Many people automatically associate serpents with temptation, deception, and the kind of knowledge that leads to spiritual downfall. But when we look at serpent symbolism across cultures and throughout history, we find a much more complex and nuanced understanding. Serpents aren't just associated with the forbidden knowledge, they are associated with knowledge that is transformative, dangerous, and necessary for spiritual development. The concept of this quote, forbidden knowledge itself needs examination. It's forbidden by who and why? Often knowledge becomes forbidden not because it's inherently evil, but because it threatens existing power structures or challenges comfortable illusions. So, in the Genesis story, what exactly does the serpent offer Eve? Knowledge of good and evil. In other words, moral discernment and the ability to make independent ethical judgments. From one perspective, this is exactly what spiritual maturity requires. The ability to think for yourself, to, evaluate situations based on your own understanding rather than blind obedience and external authority. From this reading, the serpent isn't a tempter leading humans astray. It's a teacher offering the kind of consciousness that allows for genuine spiritual development. And the fall from Eden isn't a tragedy, but a necessary step in human evolution from innocent ignorance to conscious awareness. So let's think about what Eden actually represents: a state of perfect innocence where humans live in harmony with divine will, but have no independent moral agency. They don't know good from evil because they don't need to make choices. Everything is provided, every decision is made for them. This might sound like paradise to some, but it's also the condition of children or pets. There's no real growth, no genuine responsibility, no authentic spiritual development possible in such a state. The serpent offers humanity the possibility of becoming truly conscious beings capable of moral choice and spiritual evolution. This interpretation aligns with how serpents are understood in most other spiritual traditions. They represent not evil knowledge, but gnosis, direct experiential understanding of spiritual realities that can be learned through books or transmitted through doctrine. In Gnostic traditions, the serpent in Eden is often seen as a liberator rather than this tempter, and it offers humanity the knowledge necessary to escape the false paradise of ignorance and begin the difficult but necessary journey toward genuine spiritual enlightenment. The Gnostics understood, that true spiritual development requires moving beyond simple faith and obedience to direct knowledge and personal experience of divine reality. This kind of knowledge is forbidden by religious authorities because it makes external authority unnecessary, really. When you know the divine directly, you don't need priests or books or institutions to mediate your relationship with the sacred. This Gnostic understanding of serpent wisdom appears throughout Western esoteric traditions. We see it in alchemy, the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, representing the cyclical nature of transformation and the principle that true wisdom comes through direct experience of natural process. The alchemists understood that, you can't learn the secrets of transformation by reading about them. You have to go through the process yourself. You have to allow your own consciousness to truly be dissolved and then reconstituted. You have to eat your own tail, so to speak, consume your own self to birth your new one. And the Hermetic tradition uses serpent symbolism extensively to represent the life force that animates matter and the wisdom that comes through understanding the hidden connections between all things. The caudacious two serpents intertwined around the central staff represents the balance of opposing forces that creates the conditions for higher consciousness. But here's the crucial thing to understand. This serpent wisdom isn't theoretical knowledge. It's not information you can Google or find in books. It's experiential knowledge that comes through direct encounter with forces that transform you in the process of knowing them. And in practical magical work, serpent energy is often called upon when seeking knowledge that is hidden, forbidden, or difficult to access through ordinary means. This might involve divination work that reveals uncomfortable truths about situations. It might involve, shadow work that brings repressed aspects of the psyche into consciousness, or it might involve accessing information about natural processes and spiritual realities that mainstream culture prefers to ignore. But working with serpent energy for knowledge seeking requires careful consideration of what you're asking for and whether you're prepared to handle what you might receive. Serpent wisdom doesn't come with comfort or reassurance. It often reveals things we'd rather not know about ourselves or our relationships or our circumstances. I've learned through experience that serpent consciousness has little patience for spiritual bypassing or wishful thinking. Mostly wishful thinking on my part. When you ask serpent energy for wisdom, you get truth. You get the raw, unfiltered, and sometimes difficult to accept truth. This is why many traditions consider serpent work maybe advanced or at least for more experienced practitioners. It requires significant emotional and psychological preparation. I remember particularly one intense divination session when I called upon the serpent energy to help me understand a relationship that was causing me confusion and pain. I was hoping for guidance on how to fix things, how to make the relationship work better. What I received instead was a brutal, crystal clear vision slash dream of exactly how toxic and manipulative the dynamic had become. So really, the serpent didn't tell me what I wanted to hear or what I was expecting to hear. It just showed me what I needed to know. And then it was up to me to interpret the signs and symbols. And once I had that knowledge, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to the comfortable illusions maybe I had still been maintaining. I had to act on what I had learned, even though that action was painful and difficult. And this is the nature of serpent knowledge. It changes you, it forces growth, it demands that you become more than you were before you received it. This is why it's forbidden, not because it's evil, but because it's transformative in ways that most people aren't prepared for. The serpent also teaches us about the relationship between knowledge and power. Knowledge is power. It's said all over the world. Knowledge is never neutral. It always carries the potential for both creation and destruction. The same understanding that can heal us can also harm us. The same insights that can liberate can also corrupt if they're not handled with proper respect and a sort of ethical consideration. This is why many traditional systems for transmitting serpent wisdom included extensive moral and psychological preparation. Initiation into the serpent mysteries wasn't just about receiving information, it was about developing the character and wisdom necessary to use that information responsibly. So, in contemporary magical practices, you can often lack these traditional safeguards. People can access powerful techniques and information without the community support and moral framework that maybe traditionally accompanied them. And this makes working with serpent energy both more accessible and potentially more disruptive than it was in traditional contexts. So, while this knowledge comes with responsibility, we gain access to hidden truths about ourselves and our world. We also gain the obligation to use that knowledge wisely. We can't remain innocent once we've seen behind the veil. We become accountable for what we use and what we've learned. This accountability is part of what makes serpent knowledge feel forbidden to maybe many people, and it's much easier to remain in comfortable ignorance than it is to face the responsibilities that come with real understanding. Serpent wisdom demands that we grow up spiritually, that we stop looking for external authorities to tell us what to think and feel and do. Working with serpent energy for knowledge seeking also requires developing what you could call like a digestive capacity for difficult truths. Just as serpents can swallow much larger prey than their own heads and then slowly digest it over time, we need to develop the ability to take in challenging information and integrate it gradually without being overwhelmed. This often means working with serpent energy in small doses rather than seeking dramatic revelations all at once. It means developing practices for processing and integrating new understanding, and it means being honest about the current capacity for handling difficult truths that you have within your own life. Another thing that serpent wisdom has truly brought to the light is that knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. Knowledge is information. Wisdom is the understanding of how to use information appropriately. And serpent energy can provide access to, well, tremendous amounts of knowledge. But wisdom must be earned through the experience, the reflection, and the willingness to learn from your mistakes. The true forbidden knowledge that serpents represent isn't evil or corrupting, it's simply too powerful and transformative for most people to handle without proper preparation. It's the kind of understanding that changes you fundamentally and irreversibly. And once you've received it, you can never go back to the simple innocence you had before. But for those who are ready, who have done the necessary preparation and developed the required spiritual maturity, Serpent knowledge offers something extraordinary, direct access to the mysteries that govern existence itself. The price of admission is everything you think you know about yourself and the world, and the reward is becoming who you were always meant to be. Okay, so I do want to circle back on this Kundalini thing. And in Hindu and yogic traditions, the serpent represents perhaps one of the most powerful and transformative spiritual energies known to human consciousness. Kundalini, literally meaning coiled serpent. Kundalini refers to the dormant spiritual energy that lies at the base of the spine, waiting to be awakened and directed up through the chakras to unite with divine consciousness at the crown of the head. But Kundalini isn't just a metaphor or abstract concept, it's a very real energetic phenomenon that can be experienced directly through appropriate practices. And like all aspects of serpent energy, it's simultaneously the most potent force for spiritual transformation and one of the most dangerous energies to work with if approached incorrectly. Traditional Kundalini yoga recognizes that the serpent energy must be awakened gradually and with proper preparation. So, premature or improper Kundalini awakening can cause severe physical, emotional, and psychological disturbances. This energy is so powerful that it can literally burn out unprepared nervous systems or trigger psychotic episodes in people who lack a psychological stability to handle it. Whether you believe it or in that part or not, I fucking do because I have seen some shit, experienced some shit when it comes to the Kundalini. So think about what this means. We're talking about an energy so intense that it can cause what Western psychiatry would classify as mental illness if it's not approached correctly. Spontaneous Kundalini awakenings have been mistaken for psychotic breaks, and honestly, vice versa. That gets a little messy, but people have been institutionalized for experiencing what are actually natural spiritual phenomena that they weren't prepared to handle. And this is why Kundalini or traditional Kundalini work involves years of preparation and physical conditioning through yoga and breathing exercises, emotional purification through ethical living and self discipline, mental preparation through meditation and concentration practices, and spiritual preparation through devotion and surrender to higher consciousness. The classical texts describe that Kundalini is a sleeping serpent coiled 3.5 times around the base of the spine. And when awakened properly, this serpent begins to rise through the central energy channel, activating and purifying each chakra as it ascends. When it reaches the crown chakra and unites with divine consciousness, the result is enlightenment, direct experience of the unity that underlies all existence. But the journey from the base of the spine to the crown of the head isn't a simple linear progression. Kundalini awakening involves intense purification processes as the energy burns through blockages, old patterns and stored traumas. It can trigger spontaneous emotional releases, physical sensations that range from blissful to painful, and altered states of consciousness that can be difficult to integrate. Honestly, one time I was in this I don't even know what you call it, but it was like a group meditation for Kundalini practices, and some ladies would just start screaming, some would start crying, some would start laughing. There was one lady who just like would start laughing. I'm not going to share what I did because that's a secret, but it was intense to experience to say the least. And honestly, I'm glad I got to experience that. So, in my own work with serpent energy, I found that even mild activation of Kundalini forces can create dramatic changes in consciousness and life circumstances. The energy seems to have its own intelligence and agenda, and it doesn't necessarily respect our personal timelines or comfort levels. I remember one period where spontaneous Kundalini activation led to weeks of intense physical sensations. Heat rising up my spine, electrical currents running through my nervous system, and pressure at the crown of my head that felt like someone was trying to drill a hole through my skull. Sleep became super difficult. Meditation sessions would trigger such intense energy movements that, I'd have to stop and ground myself for hours afterwards. And at the same time, I remember it was, in tandem with some Kundalini practices. and some other things I was doing, but my psychic abilities honestly exploded. It was like within 3 months, and I started receiving information about people and situations that I had no ordinary way of knowing. Dreams became a lot more prophetic, and synchronicities multiplied to the point where reality felt more like a carefully orchestrated dream rather than ordinary physical existence. And really, the emotional purification was even more intense than the physical symptoms. These years of repressed material started surfacing to be processed and integrated, and old traumas that I had thought I had dealt with came roaring back with renewed intensity, and patterns and beliefs that had been unconscious became glaringly obvious and impossible to ignore. This is why I now approach Kundalini work with tremendous respect and caution. Not that I haven't before, but I'm not trying to say I'm in any sort of traditional Kundalini work. That's definitely not the case. I've integrated it in my own way, in my own practice, how I see fit. But it's not something to be casually experimented with or pursued for ego gratification. It requires genuine commitment to spiritual development and the willingness to be fundamentally changed by the process. Kundalini also represents the life force itself, this creative energy that animates all existence. Working with this energy doesn't just lead to personal transformation, it connects us to the fundamental creative power of the universe. And it helps us to understand ourselves as expressions of the same consciousness that creates galaxies and grows flowers. So when Kundalini begins to move properly and start to shift, from its little coiled state, you start to experience yourself not as a separate individual struggling through life, but as a focal point of cosmic consciousness experiencing itself through human form. The boundaries between self and universe begin to dissolve. Little disclaimer here, always keep yourself in check when it comes to the whole spiritual psychosis thing. But you realize that the same energy that moves the planets in their orbits is the energy that beats your heart and thinks your thoughts. So, in practical magical work, understanding Kundalini principles can dramatically increase the power and effectiveness of spells and rituals. And instead of relying on external tools and techniques, you learn to generate energy from within your own system and direct it with precision and force. And for me, that's exactly what I was talking about when I picture or see these energetic serpents. It's like uh, Harry Potter, what is that called when they like speak to snakes and they can like control snakes? Anyway, this this kind of internal approach to energy work is much more sustainable, I think, and reliable than methods that depend on external sources. It comes down to application and context. So it's really, really great in some cases to lean on energy from these external sources, but when you kind of get into learning how to pull it from certain parts of yourself, that is also very useful. So when you can access the serpent power within your own body, you are no longer dependent on these perfect conditions, special tools, or other people's energy to accomplish magical goals. But working with Kundalini also teaches important lessons about relationships between this sexual energy and spiritual energy. Yes, we're going to get a little raunchy here because we're talking about snakes. But in many traditions, these aren't seen as separate forces, but as different expressions of the same fundamental life energy. Sexual energy can be transmuted into spiritual energy through appropriate practices, and spiritual energy often manifests with distinctly sexual characteristics. This connection between sexuality and spirituality makes many people feel uncomfortable, particularly those raised in traditions that see these as opposing forces. But serpent wisdom insists that real spiritual development requires integrating all aspects of our nature, including our sexual and creative energies. So the tantric traditions understand that integration perhaps better than any other spiritual system. They recognize that the same life force that creates physical pleasure, drives reproduction, is the same energy that fuels higher consciousness and mystical experience. There's lots of different angles, no pun intended, to see here when it comes to the whole sexual energy and the spiritual energy. Some traditions say you must be celibate to enlighten, some like this one, or you integrate. It's kind of all over the board, and of course, use your own discretion in what really fits for you. But, working with the Kundalini energy has really taught me that suppression or denial of sexual energy actually blocks spiritual development. So when you try to rise above your physical nature instead of integrating it, you create an internal conflict that prevents the free flow of life force through your system. The serpent also represents the wisdom of the body and the importance of embodied spirituality. Unlike traditions that encourage escape from the physical world, serpent consciousness teaches us that the body is a temple where spiritual transformation actually takes place. And Kundalini rises through the spine, through the nervous system, through the very flesh and blood of our physical existence. This means that working with serpent energy requires paying attention to your physical health, your dietary practices, exercise, and other aspects of embodied living. You can't separate spiritual development from physical well being when working with forces this powerful. I've found that serpent energy work often leads to spontaneous changes in lifestyle and habits. The energy itself seems to guide you towards choices that support its movement and integration. You might find yourself naturally drawn to different foods, different exercise practices, different sleep patterns. Honestly, I have a really hard time when it comes to staying in a routine with working out because I don't go to an actual gym anymore. So I just try to do it at home. And recently, I've had an immense amount of motivation. Like, usually, I'll do it for a couple days, fall out of it, get back into it for a couple days. But just out of nowhere, I've had the motivation to actually stay on it every single other day. Not every single day, every other day. But the serpent also can teach us about the cyclical nature of energy and the importance of both activation and rest phases. So, Kundalini awakening isn't linear, but it's a evolvement. It involves periods of intense activation followed by periods of integration and rest. And learning to honor these natural rhythms is essential for healthy serpent work. During your active phases, the energy demands your full attention and your commitment. You might feel compelled to meditate for hours. Like I said, you might dramatically have motivation to work out all the time. You might change your diet dramatically and actually have the will to stick to it and maybe to withdraw from social activities that don't support your spiritual development. These aren't times for forcing normal routines or ignoring what the energy is asking for. And then during the rest phases, the energy goes underground to integrate what has been awakened. You might feel spiritually flat or disconnected. Meditation might feel a little mechanical, and this isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's a necessary part of the process that allows for deeper integration of really what has been activated. So perhaps the most important thing is when working with Kundalini energy, it requires developing this sort of serpent patience. This energy operates according to its own timeline, not our personal agendas. It awakens when we're ready, not when we think we're ready. It creates the changes we need, not necessarily the changes we want. And the patience is difficult. It is. For many modern practitioners who want quick results and immediate gratification, but serpent wisdom teaches that real transformation takes time. If you've had a snake, it sometimes takes fucking forever for that thing to go through a shedding phase. And it's honestly a perfect like symbolism and connection. And that genuine spiritual development can't be rushed or forced, and that the most profound changes often happen slowly and subtly over years or even decades. So, learning to work with the serpent energy ultimately is about learning to trust the intelligence of the life itself. And the same consciousness that grows, our hair and heals our wounds is also capable of guiding our spiritual evolution if we learn to get out of the way and allow it to work through us. So when you surrender to this intelligence, you stop trying to control your spiritual development and start collaborating with the forces that actually govern transformation. Something extraordinary happens. You become a conscious participant in your own evolution. You align with energies that are far more powerful and intelligent than your individual will, and you discover that the serpent coiled at the base of your spine is actually the same consciousness that moves the stars in their courses. Oh my God, I just looked at the time and I have a lot more to say, and it's like already 55 minutes. Okay, well, either way, I really want to talk about the cunning, the strategy, and the survival part of the serpent and the snake. So we need to address these aspects of serpent consciousness to not make people uncomfortable, but it's very important when it comes to the symbolism and its association with cunning, strategic thinking, and what often our culture labels as deception and manipulation. We have so many sayings out there, snake in the grass, just calling someone a snake. It's, all over the place. These qualities have given serpents a negative reputation in many traditions, but understanding them properly reveals essential wisdom about survival, adaptation, and the intelligence use of power. I'm not going to say, serpents can't be the snake in the grass or whatever it is. That's actually very true. Serpents are ambush predators. They don't chase down their prey with brute force like wolves or lions. Instead, they rely on patience, timing, camouflage, and precise strikes delivered at exactly the right moment. This hunting strategy requires a completely different kind of intelligence than the pack hunting or pursuit predation we're more familiar with. Think about what it means in practical terms. A rattlesnake might lie motionless beside a rodent trail for hours or even days, waiting for the perfect opportunity. It doesn't move, it doesn't make noise, it becomes so still that it's virtually invisible, even to prey animals with highly developed survival instincts. Then, when the moment is exactly right, when the prey is in the optimal position, the serpent strikes with lightning speed and absolute precision. The strike is over in milliseconds. The prey often doesn't even realize what happened until the venom is already coursing through its system or it's being constricted. This serpentine intelligence involves the ability to remain still and unnoticed for long periods, to read subtle environmental cues, to wait for the perfect opportunity, and then to act with lightning speed and absolute precision. It's a form of strategic thinking that prioritizes effectiveness over appearance, results over process. So, in human terms, this translates to what we might call serpent wisdom. The ability to work towards your goals through indirect means, to remain patient when direct action would be counterproductive, and to strike decisively when the moment is right. But our culture has a complicated relationship with this kind of intelligence. We often prefer straightforward, aggressive approaches to problem solving. We value honesty, directness, sometimes even when they're ineffective or counterproductive. And we're more suspicious of indirect strategies and patient planning, often labeling them as manipulative or dishonest. Not that they can't be, but if we apply this correctly, you know, the cultural bias prevents many people from developing the full range of strategic capabilities that serpent consciousness offers. They reject valuable skills because they've been taught to see them as morally questionable. But serpent cunning isn't about deception for its own sake or manipulation for personal gain. It's about survival and effectiveness in challenging environments. It's about understanding that sometimes a direct approach isn't the best approach, that patience can be more powerful than force, and that strategic thinking can accomplish goals that brute force cannot. In my own life, learning to think like a serpent has been invaluable in situations where direct confrontation would have been counterproductive. Ultimately, serpent strategy teaches us to observe before acting, to understand the environment we're working in, to identify the real power dynamics and leverage points in any situation. It teaches us to conserve our energy for moments when action will be most effective, rather than exhausting ourselves in futile struggles. This doesn't mean being dishonest or manipulative in harmful ways. It means being strategic about when, how, and with who we share information and energy. It means understanding that not every situation calls for complete transparency, that sometimes protecting ourselves and our goals requires discretion and careful timing. So the serpent also teaches us about the power of stillness and non action. In a culture obsessed with constant activity and immediate results, the ability to remain still and patient is almost revolutionary. Serpents can remain motionless for hours or days, conserving energy while waiting for the right opportunity. And this capacity for strategic stillness is incredibly valuable in modern life. Learning when not to act, when to wait for better conditions, and when to let situations develop naturally rather than forcing them toward premature resolution. I found that some of my most successful magical workings have involved serpent like patience. Naturally, I've always kind of fell into the observation category rather than the acting category just growing up. But Again, it's been invaluable when it comes to magic. Setting intentions and then waiting for the right moment to manifest them rather than trying to force immediate results. This approach often leads to outcomes that are better than what I originally even planned because the energy has time to find the most elegant and effective path to manifestation. Serpent consciousness also teaches about the intelligent use of fear and intimidation. Snakes use threat displays. They use hissing, coiling, showing fangs, bright colors to avoid actual conflicts whenever possible. The most famous is the rattlesnake, right? They prefer to scare off threats rather than engage in dangerous physical confrontations. This principle applies beautifully to human conflict resolution. Sometimes the mere demonstration of your capacity for retaliation is enough to deter harmful behavior. Sometimes letting people know that you have options and resources prevents them from testing your boundaries. So there's also this shadow side of serpent energy, and this includes the capacity for what I kind of call like a necessary ruthlessness. Serpents don't hesitate to strike when their survival is at stake. They don't worry about being nice or popular when fundamental needs are at stake. And this ruthless clarity about priorities can be extremely valuable for people who tend to sacrifice their own well being for others' comfort. Serpent energy teaches that there are times when being liked is less important than being respected, times when maintaining relationships is less important than maintaining integrity. Learning to access this ruthless aspect of serpent consciousness has helped me set and maintain boundaries that protect my energy, time, and well being. It's taught me that kindness without boundaries often enables harmful behavior, and that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. But perhaps most importantly, serpent shadow work teaches us to integrate these strategic and survival oriented aspects of consciousness rather than projecting them onto others. When we deny our own capacity for cunning, strategy, and ruthlessness, we often become prey to people who have no such inhibitions. So, really, the key is learning to use all these capabilities ethically and appropriately. Serpent cunning in service of genuine needs and legitimate goals is wisdom. The same capabilities used for purely selfish or harmful purposes become destructive. And working with serpent shadow energy requires honest self assessment about your motivations and your intentions. It requires developing the moral sophistication to distinguish between necessary strategy and harmful manipulation, between appropriate boundaries and cruel rejection, between, this protective ruthlessness and unnecessary cruelty. When you can make these distinctions clearly, when you can access your serpent nature consciously and deliberately, you become a much more effective and empowered person. You stop being prey, you start being a conscious participant in the complex game of life, and capable of both great compassion and fierce protection as circumstances require. So honestly, this is the gift of serpent shadow work. Not becoming cold or cruel, but becoming complete. Integrating all aspects of your nature so that you can respond appropriately to whatever life presents you with. Okay, Annika, let's start to wrap this up. So, beginning any serpent work. I truly recommend spending time observing actual snakes if possible. You know, visit a zoo, a nature center, a snake sanctuary. If you have someone that you know that owns a snake, watch how they move, how they rest, how they respond to their environment. The more you understand about actual serpent behavior, the better you'll be able to work with serpent consciousness. If you can't observe living snakes, spend time studying, high quality videos or documentaries. Pay attention not just to their hunting and feeding behaviors, but to their more subtle activities, how they shed their skins, how they thermoregulate, how they interact with their environment. Watch a snake striking at prey. Notice the perfect stillness that precedes the attack, the complete commitment once the decision is made. There's this absence of hesitation or second guessing. This is the quality of consciousness that you are learning to access. And then you can start to develop this sort of serpent consciousness, right? Through your meditation and visualization practices. This involves learning to access states of awareness that mirror serpent mental states, patient stillness, acute sensory awareness, and the ability to strike with precision when action is needed. One of my favorite serpent meditation techniques involves visualizing yourself as a snake lying in warm sunlight. Feel the sun on your scales, the solid earth beneath your body. Notice how completely still you can be while remaining absolutely alert to everything happening in your environment. Practice maintaining this state of relaxed alertness for extended periods. And another valuable practice involves working with the serpentine movement of energy in your body. Lie down comfortably and visualize energy moving in slow, undulating waves from the base of your spine up through your torso and out through the top of your head. Allow this energy to move at its own pace without forcing or rushing it. Because if you've ever been around a snake, you have to let them move at their own pace. For, maybe more advanced works, you can do the breath work, which is incredibly powerful. I talked about some of this in my shape-shifting episode, and this involves breathing in slow, deep waves that mirror the movement of a serpent's body. Inhale while visualizing energy coiling at the base of your spine, then exhale while allowing the energy to uncoil and rise through your body. When it comes to ritual work with serpent energy, some of the most powerful applications tend to focus on transformation, knowledge seeking, and protection. Serpent energy is particularly effective for rituals designed to help you shed old patterns, access hidden information, or establish strong energetic boundaries. For transformation work, you can create rituals around the intention of shedding old skins. I know this might be a little bit gross. I think I touched on it on a meditation that I did, but if you can imagine yourself being swallowed whole by a snake, that is very useful for transmutation and transformative work and even rebirth work. So, knowledge seeking rituals with the serpent energy require particular care and preparation. Remember that serpent wisdom often comes in forms that are difficult to digest. Before asking for hidden knowledge, make sure you are genuinely prepared to handle whatever you might receive. Create strong protective boundaries and have integration practices ready for afterwards. Protection rituals using serpent energy work can be extraordinarily powerful. Visualize yourself surrounded by coiled serpents that will strike at anyone who approaches with harmful intent, or work with the image of the Urias, the protective cobra, rising from your forehead to ward off negative energies. So, finally, if you start to actually encounter serpent energy, whether it's through actual snake sightings or symbolic appearances, pay attention to what is happening in your life at that moment. Are you in a period of transition? Are there old patterns you need to shed? Is there hidden knowledge you need to access? Are you facing challenges that require strategic thinking rather than direct action, or is it simply a warning? The context of serpent encounters, often provides clues about what kind of serpent wisdom you need to access. A snake shedding its skin might indicate it's time for your own transformation. A coiled snake might suggest the need for patience and strategic waiting. A striking serpent could be a signal that it's time for action. But working with serpent energy goes beyond occasional magical practices or responding to omens. The deepest teachings of serpent wisdom involve integrating these principles into your daily life and way of being. So there are obviously a million things under the sun that you can connect to serpent energy, but living with serpent wisdom means taking responsibility for the full spectrum of your nature. This includes not just your capacity for love and compassion, but also your capacity for strategic thinking, protective aggression, and necessary ruthlessness. The serpent teaches that spiritual maturity involves integrating your shadow rather than denying it. When your own full range of capabilities, you become less likely to project these qualities onto others or to be victimized by people who have no moral restraints. And the integration doesn't mean being cold or cruel, it means becoming complete. So you become capable of both fierce protection and gentle nurturing as circumstances require. The wise serpent knows when to strike and when to remain still, when to reveal and when to conceal, and when to shed old skins and when to rest in the warmth of what has been achieved. So, as I conclude this exploration of all things snakes, I want to leave you with this understanding. The serpent is not asking you to become something you're not, it's asking you to become fully aware of what you already are. And the capacity for transformation, for strategic intelligence, for protective power, your patient wisdom, these are all natural aspects of human consciousness. The serpent simply teaches us to how to access and integrate these qualities consciously and skillfully. So thank you all for listening on another one of these episodes. I hope you all gained something from it. And if you stayed to the end, thank you again so much. And as usual, wherever you are, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.